Hello, I'm Delaney Ruston, primary care physician and creator with Lisa Tabb of the 4 Screenagers movies, and this is Parenting in the Screen Age, a show about discovering the best ways to help our youth and ourselves navigate our rapidly changing digital world. In today's episode, I continue my conversation with educator and author Christopher Pepper and journalist Joanna Schroeder, who together wrote the brand new book called Talk with Your Boys. We began our discussion in the last episode, which is titled Talking to Your Boys, Masculinity, Gaming, and Their Online Lives. In it, we explore how boys absorb messages about masculinity through violent media and gaming, and we offer skills we can equip them with to handle those kind of things. And one of my favorite was the interrupter technique. Today, we get gritty with real-life strategies for talking to boys about 3 prickly topics: the fast-growing world of online sports betting, navigating healthy romantic relationships, and last but definitely not least, pornography. Because pornography is such a hard subject, I was just thinking about, here's something you may want to try. Give your teen a choice. Let them know you learned some important things about pornography you'd like to share with them, having listened to this podcast. But then ask them, would they rather hear it directly from you or have them listen to the very short segment of this podcast where you learned it? Sometimes giving that choice can make the conversation go smoother. And if you want, you could add some humor. You could say, or third choice, you could have a one-way ticket to Mars, and they'll probably pick that one. Okay, let's get started.
Part of the reason that we wrote a book called Talk to Your Boys is because we know that these conversations that boys are going online for information, especially in middle school and high school, and they're often looking for very basic ideas about how do I get bigger muscles? How do I get a girl to like me? How can I get rich? Those kind of questions that you can imagine middle schoolers just has on their mind. They're typing them into the computer without much thought. But there is an algorithm that is ready to market things back to them. And when you go online and that algorithm figures out that you're a teenage boy, you start to get a real program of things coming at you, often things around sports betting and gambling, some around fighting and guns, things around women. So you get this whole slew of things coming at you. And that's where we really need adults to be in the mix there. We don't want to be letting the internet have all the voices in that kid's life. We want to be in that conversation and guiding them through these things that they're going to see online.
Yeah. With online betting, sports betting, a high percentage of teenage boys are doing sports betting. In your groups working with boys, Christopher, what are you hearing them say about it? And how do you bring up conversations to get them to think critically about all of this?
Sure. For many years, young people, and especially young boys, have been interested in ways to make a lot of money fast. That's not a new concern, but this is a promise that is sold. If you turn on any kind of sports on TV, the ads many of them are about sports betting and crypto. And they're both kind of in this idea that holding out this promise that you can invest a small amount of money and make a whole lot of money overnight and become rich without really doing much work. And it's a scheme. And it is very appealing. And the sort of gamification of sports betting that happens via an app on your phone, it feels like a video game. And kids are trained for this by, they're going on, instead of you're replacing your Robux with dollars in sports betting, kids have been trained by spending video game dollars, how this works. And the problem that you have is that many young men start putting down real money into these situations with credit cards and get into a lot of debt before they have much of an understanding of how money works and the value of, like how much money do you actually make from a paycheck from a job. That same rule about casinos, the house always wins, applies to online gaming just as much as it does if you walk into a casino. People have this story that they're going to make a lot of money at it, but ultimately they almost always lose.
Yeah.
Our kids are smart. Teenagers are smart. Sometimes they may make us think that they're not, but they are. And a simple thing like, how do you think these businesses that allow sports betting, how do you think they make money? Could they make money if most people won? Could they make money if anybody won consistently? And what do you think happens if someone is really smart and does start winning consistently? And then go looking for the answers. The resources are out there. In reality, and this is a reality check that I gave my own boys, when someone starts winning in online sports betting, their accounts get suspended and then they get deleted. They don't let you win. If they let you win, they would not have a business. And for my kids, at least, and most of the young men I've talked to about this, a light bulb goes on because it makes sense.
Relationships and sexuality. Let's start with relationships. You've talked to a lot of boys about this. I like in the book you talk about what expectations to have, what's okay. You talk about the idea of if a girl did that, should the guy still keep going out with her? Just some really unique questions that parents don't think to bring up.
I love that you're asking about this. I think we talk very little to boys and young men about relationships, and often they don't have the idea that they can have standards or expectations. So I think it's really important to let them know that they can create the kind of relationships that they want to have in their lives, and they can set limits just as much as anyone else can. Often these stereotypes about sexuality and boys come into play, where boys get the message like, oh, I'm supposed to be horny all the time and interested in sex. If there's sex available somewhere, I just got to say yes and do it and get as much sex as I can. Kind of this idea of like manipulating other people. It doesn't matter if you lie or use sort of manipulation tactics. The goal is to have as much sex as possible. And I don't think that's right. And I don't think that leads to happy relationships. I want anyone of any age who's deciding to get into a relationship where they're in a room with someone else to feel like, yes, this is something I want to do. I have full agency about deciding to be here. I feel like I can leave if I'm not comfortable, and I can set guidelines about what I want to do. And the truth is that many teenage boys don't want to have sex right now. They're like, oh, maybe if I actually think about what I want, maybe I'd be into like kissing or hugging. And I don't know if I want to do more than that. I'd have to think about it for a while. But often this idea that adults have that like young men want to have sex all the time doesn't actually match up with what they say.
Anytime you can seize a moment when you're together and something happens on TV or out in the world, seize a quick little moment to just be like, man, that was awkward. I wonder where the guy got the idea to do that. Or like, oh man, that turned her off. And I noticed like he was coming on too strong. Just little things like that to get them thinking about how the other person feels.
A great experiment would be, depending on your kid's age and if you think it's appropriate, like a teenager, is How I Met Your Mother. Have them watch that an episode, and how many times is the idea of casual sex or just get sex mentioned? I mean, the number of references to just guys and sex on Friends, on How I Met Your Mother, it's so interwoven into almost every episode of these shows. It's pretty amazing the subconscious ways and conscious ways that they're being fed the message that you bring up. So,
and it's great to point out to boys, do you like how men are portrayed in this way? They're so one-dimensional. Like those characters are so one-dimensional from those shows. Does that resonate with you?
Excellent.
And making sure that it's safe for them to talk about the kind of relationship that they would like to have, and then to talk about those sort of emotional things. Like, how would you feel if somebody is texting you 10 times a day? Would that feel like they really care about you and they're checking up on you and they want to be in touch a lot? Or would it feel like they're trying to control you and be all up in your business all the time?
And would you let them track you on an app and share your location at all times? That is a very big Screenagers issue with our teenagers that is very relevant.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can I have the password to your phone?
Yeah.
Yeah. Talk about those things now. Absolutely. And really validate that having privacy, even in a close relationship, is perfectly good. In fact, it can be very important. And really, the relationships aren't about this complete fusion of self with another person. I like you also bring up the idea of letting them ponder in their head questions that are hard to ask, hard to answer, such as, do you think you want to get married? Do you want to have a lot of relationships before? Like, kind of weird questions to ask a 16-year-old. But you think that can be really helpful. Is that right, Christopher?
Totally. Doing a little bit of life planning and thinking about a lot of what people do when they're teenagers, like things like having friendships and hanging out separately from adults, having romantic relationships and dating. They're practicing for the kind of lives that they might want to have as adults. And they're learning skills, they're learning what things feel like. And if somebody hurts their feelings, they're going to say, I don't want to be in a relationship like that. I want someone who treats me differently. And if you maybe they get in a relationship with someone who makes plans and then doesn't show up, and they say, I don't want to be with somebody like that. Like, those are learning moments.
And obviously for us as adults who have a bigger range of this, have you talked to them? What has that conversation gone like?
Start with just questions like, how did that feel? You're trying to connect with them emotionally, to be really empathetic. Like, oh, even if you're in your head thinking they'll get over this, it's not that big of a deal. In the moment, recognizing that those teenage relationships for someone who hasn't ever experienced that before can feel totally overwhelming and really, really important. So hanging in with them for that and saying, like, you must be really sad about that. That must have been really disappointing. And just being there. And then some of those guiding questions around, what kind of relationship would you like to have in your life? What kind of, when you picture yourself at 30 years old, do you think you'd have a partner? Like, do you think is having kids in your life, is that important to you? I think those are good questions for people to think about, because it helps guide what they do with their lives.
Yeah, their brain isn't necessarily, and nor would mine have been thinking that far ahead, but it's just one more technique of asking questions to get critical thinking.
And what's so interesting to me is we have these conversations with girls a lot. It doesn't necessarily mean that the girls have the answers, but we think, I've got to prepare this girl for her future life in relationships to protect her. A lot of times it's about protecting her. Does she know whether she wants to wait until marriage when it comes to sex? Does she know that someone could screenshot her sexy photos that she might be texting? Does she know that why don't we do this with boys? And that is what's wild, is a lot of times people hear Christopher and myself talking about what we've learned researching and writing this book. And they're like, well, like, it's obvious you should talk to your kids about that. And then we say to the men, did anyone talk to you about this? Oh, no, never. Have you talked to your son about this? Well, no, I haven't, but. And then the teenage boys, has anybody talked to you about what you'd want out of a relationship? Not really. Has anyone told you that you don't have to necessarily want sex all the time when you're 17 years old? No, I mean, I've always heard that's what you do. It seems obvious, but it's actually completely revolutionary to say, you got to talk to your boys about how they feel. Wild idea, but true.
Yeah. And to ask questions about relationships. Have you talked to that person about this issue? And how would you talk to that person about it? Because it's this mythology, because we don't see relationships really played out in healthy ways in the movies we watch. It's just finally getting they're finally together at the end. So how does a relationship really build? Have you talked about the fact that they're texting all the time and it's making you feel uncomfortable? And they'll say, no, I don't want to. How would you? Do you want to text that question? And texting communication is okay. That's part of it. We've had such an emphasis. You have to say it in person. That's going to land flatly. A lot of them, we can say that, but no, they want to think through it and they want to do it through text. And I can tell you many adults are doing that as well. We ideally, particularly when they're tricky things to do in person, but we have to let them have a whole range, because if we just say you have to do it in person, they're not going to come to us.
And they have a culture. They have a culture, and it is different than our culture. And to some degree, we have to respect that. In other ways, we can say, I understand that's teenage culture right now. I don't expect you to do it that way. I expect you to do it a different way. But there are things, like you're saying, it is important to them. And other kids may receive things strangely if they go outside of that teenage cultural standard expected way to communicate, right?
Texting things for a parent, sometimes texting things to your kid when they're important and you want to be really clear and direct, that can be a great technique.
Yes.
It's important to try and sit down with them in real life too, but there's lots of ways to communicate. And sometimes when you want to get something across, that's a very effective way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what we also learned in the research, Dr. Stantakin, who uses biology, physiology, and psychology in his practice and his research, he explains a lot of times with young people, especially teenage boys, you've got to be moving while you're talking. That if he's shutting down and turning away or leaving, just take a walk, just carry the groceries in from the car, just take the trash cans out, just move while you're talking. And he has a whole awesome scientific explanation that we put in the book of what happens in the brain when you're moving versus when you're sitting at the dining room table and having this very serious conversation. And it can work wonders for helping your child open up.
Absolutely. And by our weekly conversations, we've had lots of families doing Tech Talk Tuesdays. It's very much not saying have those kind of conversations all the time there or anything like that. You know, we talk about the car, you can talk about playing a game together, all these different ways to make it less intense is indeed the goal.
Before we dive back in, I wanted to let you know about our 4 Screenagers documentaries, which focus on helping kids and teens navigate the challenges of this digital age. We created these films to be screened in schools and at community events. Over 20,000 hosts have shown them thus far. Along with the movies, we provide discussion guides, promotional materials, and other tools so that you can easily organize a truly impactful event for your community. And if your school wants to use the movies in the classroom, we have options for that too, along with a full curriculum of lesson plans designed for various grade levels. To learn more about the movies or inquire about becoming a host, visit screenagersmovie.com. There's a link in the show notes. Now back to the show.
Speaking of intense, I want to have our last topic be about pornography, which also includes highly sexualized content in, Euphoria and all sorts of different shows. So it's not just pornography.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if you guys can say some points about conversations we can have.
Sure. So I think adults need to be aware that porn is ubiquitous, and if their kid has access to the internet, they're going to see porn, either intentionally or unintentionally. Young people, they're going to encounter porn. The most common kind of porn that people see at that age are on tube sites, which are like YouTube, sites that hold short videos of people doing sexual things. And unfortunately, I'll say this as a health teacher, I would like to see us as a country having really robust sex education that teaches about how sexuality works and how people's bodies develop and things like that. Unfortunately, that is not universally the case. Sex education is taught really differently from place to place in the US. So I think it's actually understandable why young people who are curious about, how do bodies work? What does a naked person look like? How does sex work? If they're not receiving that information from any reliable source in their life, it makes sense to me why they might go on their phone and Google and try and figure it out from what's available online. And what they're going to get is explicit images, explicit videos. And the concern about that is they are not very good sources of education about how sex works. They're meant for entertainment. They're not a great source for actual sex education. And what's different about how things were a generation or two ago when somebody might have looked at a Playboy magazine or seen an occasional VHS tape, X-rated VHS tape or things like that, is just the amount that's available, that someone can go on a website and see a porn clip and then just keep going and watch them for a long time, and that there's sort of an endless stream of material available for free, and the age limits on it, it says you're supposed to be 18 to watch this. Are you 18? And you click a button that says yes, and that's the barrier to entry. It's something that we need to talk to young people about, and to say, if you're online and you see porn, here's some things to know about it. If you're seeing sexual, we sometimes talk about this as sexually explicit media. That's been a term that's some schools have been able to work with that as far as teaching lessons around this. It doesn't work very well to go in and say we're going to teach a lesson about porn in schools, but you can talk about, like you said, Euphoria and other TV shows that have sexual material in them, even if they're a mainstream show. And you can talk about TV commercials that use sexual imagery to sell bubble gum and hamburgers and beer. Those kind of, the kids see those things. And what the approach that works often well is to talk about media literacy. So the same kind of questions that you could apply to other materials, saying who made this, what was their reason for making this, is there a message they're trying to get across, what's left out of it, I think is a really important question for porn, because especially on tube sites, it cuts right to action. So you're seeing bodies pushing together or doing some kind of sexual thing. There's no conversation ahead of time about, are these people in a relationship? Have they talked about sexually transmitted infections? Have they talked about reducing pregnancy risk? Do they like each other? You have no idea about any of those circumstances. Did they consent to being in this film, which is a concern that sometimes comes up with some of the materials that are available for free? What happened afterwards, which in a real life sexual situation will often include cuddling, kissing, somebody running to the bathroom, somebody getting a leg cramp, all kinds of awkward things that happen in real life. So it's more like my friend Shafia Zaloom uses this analogy saying, like, it's like if you were trying to watch The Fast and the Furious to learn how to drive, you're watching entertainment to learn a real life skill, and it just doesn't match very well.
I find analogies are really helpful. That analogy from Shafia Zaloom is so amazing. Like I watch it click with young people in their minds the moment I say it. It's like, oh, got it. It's such a great tool for parents. And ultimately, if we need to practice talking about sexually explicit material with our friends, with our partners, in order to be able to come to our kids and do it without shame or blame, do it. You need to practice it. Like, you don't get up on the mound and try and throw a fastball without rehearsing, without practicing, without throwing a million bullpens. It's the same way with talking about things that are hard to talk about. And this is the one thing that I have found: the people I work with and my friends, they really just don't know how to start, and they go in and it's very shamey, very blamey, very anti-sex, even if they don't feel that way. So, but you got to practice.
Yeah. And I mean, you guys have really just touched on the fact that some teens go on to get information about it. The reality is some go on for the the pleasure aspect of it. It's lighting up the brain area of pleasure. I know teen boys who saw that it was getting really reinforcing. They didn't like the way that it was impacting how they thought about girls in the classroom. I mean, they started to see how it was messing with their brains, and they either stopped or decreased. I mean, as a doctor, I've talked to young people in many different settings, and this has come up.
Anything can become maladaptive, and I taught my kids the word maladaptive very early on. It's dorky of me, but this is my work. But anything that we could normally be healthy, video game use, looking at explicit material, even exercise or eating healthy food, if we start doing it to soothe the part of ourselves that actually needs some healing and some real care, or to distract ourselves, that can become maladaptive. And a lot of times that looks like needing more and more and more. So I would look at the kid and say, a lot of people find themselves in a situation where they look at something that's sexually explicit. It's really exciting. It lights up all those pleasure parts of the brain. But what some people experience is then you need something a little bit more hardcore, or a little more risky, or a little more shocking in order to get that initial feeling of surprise. And a lot of times, if you get to that point, you might want to ground yourself and say, hey, I don't necessarily like where this is going. This isn't really the kind of sex I want to have someday if I'm not having sex already. And putting in their minds just the mere idea of this might be getting a little bit out of hand. And we don't have to become overreactive about porn addiction. That a lot of kids kind of roll their eyes at that.
It's important to really get clear about your own morals and beliefs around porn, because people have a variety of beliefs about this. And it's okay to communicate those. I do think that there's a real risk around making kids feel ashamed about curiosity or about masturbation. And that takes some practice to figure out how are you going to express your concerns, if you have concerns about porn, without making kids feel bad about what they're doing or what they're interested in, what they're curious about, or about masturbation in general, which is very common and natural part of being a human being. And I don't want to lean on shame as a teaching tool, and that is something that we repeat in many chapters of our book, is trying to have real conversations without making young people feel ashamed about some aspect of themselves or their behavior.
And that can be hard to do because that's pretty much how most of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s were talked to about sex, was with shame. And we were scared out of having desire or scared out of showing desire. And it's a very unhealthy place to be. So if we allow ourselves and our first base instincts to run the show when we're talking about sex and porn, a lot of times we'll just start repeating the patterns of things that didn't work well in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. And then finding that fine line like we're talking about, because we don't want to be condoning it. We don't want to say it's nothing and it has no, and that's totally fine. We know many boys and girls shut down when we talk about things that they feel we don't understand, or it's their sexuality, it's their relationships with people, all their online lives. What do you want to give as a reinforcer, motivation enhancer to parents to do this work?
Boys are really much more open to having conversations about emotions and to thinking deeply about relationships than stereotype would give them credit for. I think there's a real space for growth for men. So if you're a man, or if you're a dad, or a man who's a mentor or a coach, and you're working with boys, being able to narrate your emotions that you're feeling, talk more about a full range of emotions, that's a really important thing to do. And it's something that can be really beneficial. And to let them see you making time for your friends, making time for your hobbies, being a full person in the world who sometimes is sad, sometimes is disappointed, sometimes is super excited and has joy and has real connections with other people. That's a real gift. Be attentive to the teenagers in your life and recognize that you're going to have to be attuned to those moments, because they're not a little kid who's going to be running to your arms every time they need something. You have to be a little bit of a detective, a little bit more aware of nuance of when is a good time to talk to them. And it may many people find like it's at the end of the day when you're tired and you want to go to bed, suddenly your teenager is open to having a conversation. It may be when you're driving to a certain place. It may be when you go out and play basketball together, but just be attentive to those moments and take advantage of them to have real conversations, and don't expect that you're going to have an hour-long lecture. You're going to have a 5-minute meaningful conversation, and you'll have lots of times to do that if you're paying attention and keep those connections alive.
Yeah, we have to break the stereotype that boys are shut down and angry and closed off, and that's just how they are. And talking to our boys is really the revolution that they need in their lives. Just talk to them.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much. And I just want to thank you so much for the work you're doing.
Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Before we wrap up, I just want to underline something Joanna said that I think is so key. Many dads just don't feel comfortable having these kind of conversations with their boys, in large part because their dads or other men didn't really talk to them about these things. So sharing this episode with a dad who didn't grow up getting these kind of conversations in their lives can be a nice way to say, hey, this is hard and here's some tools. And moms, this is for you too. Talking about these topics is not easy. And anxiety can nudge us to avoid the tough stuff, so give yourself grace. And if there's a dad in your life who keeps putting off these talks, give them grace as well. Small steps, lots of grace. That's how these conversations are going to happen. What a gift that you tuned into the show today. The Screenagers podcast and movement is all about learning together how we can best help our youth of all ages
our communities, and ourselves best navigate our rapidly changing digital world. Make sure to follow/subscribe to the podcast to get each episode automatically, and the more subscribers, the easier it is for others to find us. And if you give it a like and write a review, even just one sentence, that helps even more. Check out Screenagersmovie.com to get resources for each episode and loads of other resources. Learn about our 4 Screenagers films and find my weekly parenting blog, Tech Talk Tuesdays. And be sure to use the search bar to find many topics you might be wondering about among hundreds of my past blogs. Finally, I love hearing from you, so email me at Delaney@Screenagersmovie.com. What ideas do you want to hear for future episodes? Today's show was produced by the following people: me, your host, Delaney Ruston, Lisa Tabb, and sound editing was done by Alan Gofinski.